All right, the attorneys and the judge are talking about whether these convicted murderers should benefit in any way financially from sharing their story, and we'll let you know what the judge says on that. But today, we now know the sentencing for the three men convicted in the killing of Ahmaud Arbery. Travis McMichael, the man who pulled the trigger, 35 years old, is sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. His father, Gregory McMichael, is also sentenced to life in prison without parole. William Roddy Bryan, the man with the cell phone who took the video the world has now seen, who used his truck to block Ahmaud Arbery in the street, the judge saying it was a little different. He said he saw some remorse and concern from William Roddy Bryan. He is giving him the opportunity to have parole, but he is still going to serve a life sentence, which under the state of Georgia is 30 years. The judge giving some very powerful statements leading up to his decision in the sentencing of these three men from the murder that happened in February of 2020. The judge saying that he spent a lot of time thinking about this case and that he thought so much about the terror that must have been in the mind of Ahmaud Arbery in the 5 minutes he was running for his life, the judge's words, as these three men chased him. And a very compelling moment in court when the judge said that he was going to use the words of the defendants themselves to guide his sentencing. And he shared statements that they gave, disparaging statements towards Ahmaud Arbery, threatening statements they made to him that was recorded in the video there on the street, and talked about the moment when Ahmaud Arbery's body fell to the ground and the judge said the men turned their backs and walked away. The judge said, quote, "This was a killing, it was callous." He talked about the fact that this grand lesson, the greater lesson, he said in this case, is that assuming the worst in others shows the worst in someone's character. If you're just joining us, sentencing has come down for the three men convicted of murder for Ahmaud Arbery. The McMichaels, father and son, both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The other man, William Bryan, is life in prison with the possibility of parole. We want to bring in now former DeKalb County Prosecutor Robert James for his thoughts on both what the judge said and the decision of sentencing for this judge. Mr. James, what are your thoughts?
Well, the judge's statements were powerful. Some of the most powerful I think I've ever seen in my going on 23-year career, made from the bench. You can tell this case really affected him. You can also tell that he really paid attention to everything that was said and to all the evidence that was presented. I was wrong. I thought this was going to be a difficult decision for him. I don't believe it was a difficult decision for him. I think he was moved by not just what Ahmaud Arbery went through during those 5 minutes while he was running for his life in terror, but he was also moved by perhaps the most compelling evidence, which were the words from the defendants, their words and their actions. And I think he was moved by that. And I think, quite frankly, he was disturbed by that. And the sentence reflected that. Now, what we need to understand about the sentence is that it wasn't just life without parole, but it was life without parole plus 20 years to run consecutive. Now, what that means with both Travis McMichael and his father is that, it's life without parole, which means you don't ever get parole, but then we add 20 years to run on top of that. Now I know that's a legal fiction, so how do you add 20 years on that? But he's basically saying, I'm going to max you out and give you the max on everything. Because what he could have done was given life without parole and run 20 years concurrent, which means it ran at the same time. But he stacked it on top of the life without parole, and so that is, that shows that he felt like this was an extreme scenario that really required an extreme response.
It is. It's a statement sentencing. He's saying that they'll die in prison, but as you said, plus 20, it is as much as could have happened in this case, despite hearing the calls and pleas for leniency from the attorneys for the defendants. I was really struck, like you were, Mr. James, about some of the words he was using. He used calculated, chilling, disturbing. that they hunted him down. They hunted Mr. Arbery down. He was, it seemed to me too that he knew what was going to happen, and that was very interesting to hear his thoughts about that. You talked a lot about the fact that the discussion about race as a motivator could not really be part of this because it doesn't fall under a hate crime legislation for a state trial. But you heard him really address that as well in some of his statements, in some of the same ways we heard the attorneys address it.
Well, everybody talked about race without saying the word race, right? He talked about neighbor, he talked about other. And so, anyone with half a brain can understand that he's talking about the relationship between, white people and black people in this society, and how communities are largely segregated, and how we have to expand our definition of neighbor beyond the people that live next to us and look like us and walk and talk and think like us, but to others. And he talked about that because I think he wanted to send the message that as a society, that is where we have to go, and we have to get there, soon. But he talked about race, and I think he understood that a lot of their actions were motivated by race, quite frankly. He understood that, the prosecution understood that, I think the jurors understood that, but no one said that, no one said the word race. And I think, again, a big part of that, the reason that couldn't be conspicuously argued was because the evidence wasn't put in, wasn't put before the jury because of the lack of a hate crime statute here in Georgia.
And then that closing thought that he left us all with when he talked about if there is perhaps a grand lesson from this case, it is that assuming the worst in others brings out the worst in our characters, or assuming the best shows the best in us. When we talk about a motivation, again, reading between the lines of what the judge was saying, that's another important point that he made. And it was interesting, Mr. James, as he was talking about remorse, what he said to Mr. Bryant about, I see he did have remorse, that there was concern. What that tells you is that he did not see that in the other two defendants, which is another nod to the plus 20 that you were bringing up in the sentencing.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember what he said. It was remorse is more than what you say. It's, and I'm gonna sort of paraphrase and ad lib, but it's manifested through your actions and your deeds.
Right.
And he talked about how they, moments after they had just killed him, they're making these comments and they just callously walk away while Ahmaud Arbery is either lying dead on the ground or dying on the ground. And they're not screaming and crying, oh my God, I just shot a man, somebody call 911, which is what, an average person or an ordinary person would do if they just shot someone. But they're walking around and essentially saying, well, you didn't do anything wrong, and making other disparaging comments, and then just walk away and leave Ahmaud on the ground. And I think that affected him. And I think that is one of the judge's chief motivation, when he said, you didn't have the remorse that they said you had, and therefore I'm going to hammer you, and excuse the language, but I'm going to hammer you and max you out under this statute.
So we know there'll be an appeal process. We know that a federal hate crime trial against these three men is yet to come, but as of today, this part is closed as the judge gives his sentence for these three men. We cannot thank you enough, Robert, for your insight and your perspective, your analysis today. We really appreciate the time as we've followed this case from start to finish, and we'll continue to follow the next layers as well, so thank you.